The Dark Scrolls. Most women are haunted by memories of love stolen or innocence betrayed, but few in history have carried the burden of a secret so obscene that entire dynasties try to disguise it as divine will. Imagine being born into a palace where your father is not merely a king, but a living god, so powerful that when he reaches for you, no one dares to call it a crime. In that suffocating labyrinth of ambition and incense, a young girl named Arsinoe would learn that a queen's body was never truly her own. Her name, Arsinoe II Philadelphus, would one day be carved into temples and minted onto coins. But beneath those polished tributes lay the stench of blood, betrayal, and incest, a tale so disturbing that it blurred the line between dynasty and madness. To understand how she became both revered and reviled, we must begin in the age when Alexander the Great's generals were carving the world into pieces. Arsinoe was born around 316 BCE into the Macedonian Greek dynasty of the Ptolemaic, the family that ruled Egypt after Alexander's empire splintered apart. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, was no mere soldier. He was a master tactician and a ruthless manipulator who claimed to descend from Hercules himself. Egypt was his prize, a kingdom that had worshipped living gods for millennia, and Ptolemy had no intention of being anything less. Arsinoe grew up in Alexandria, a city of wonders that rose from the sand like a mirage. Vast libraries of papyrus scrolls, marble temples shimmering in the relentless sun, palaces draped in embroidered silks from India. To an outsider, it must have seemed like paradise. But inside the royal chambers, she learned that paradise had rules written in hunger and fear. A daughter's worth was measured by the alliances she could forge and the bloodlines she could preserve. By the time she was a teenager, Arsinoe was already a piece on a chessboard of thrones. Her father decided her first marriage would not be in Egypt, but far to the north, in the crumbling domains of Thrace and Macedon. Her chosen husband was Lysimachus, one of Alexander's oldest generals, a man perhaps 50 years older than her. Some claimed he was charmed by her beauty. More likely, he simply understood that binding himself to the Ptolemaic dynasty would solidify his rule. And so Arsinoe was dispatched across the Aegean like a sacrificial offering. She traveled by ship, accompanied by dozens of attendants and chests of dowry treasures, fine gold jewelry, bolts of embroidered linen, and perfumed oils that masked the stink of the ship's bilges. It must have struck her then how swiftly one's fate could be packed into crates and loaded onto a deck. Lysimachus received her not merely as a bride, but as a political endorsement, proof to the Macedonian nobility that he was no senile warlord clinging to past glories. For a while, Arsinoe played her part dutifully. She bore him children, 3 sons who carried the mingled bloodlines of Alexander's 2 greatest generals. But if she hoped for affection, she was disappointed. Lysimachus already had many other wives and concubines, and his court was a nest of jealousies. In the shadows of that aging king's palace, Arsinoe learned to watch and wait. Her intelligence was sharp, her ambition sharper. She knew that any woman, even the daughter of Ptolemy, could be cast aside once her usefulness waned. And when Lysimachus began to show signs of frailty, an old man's trembling hands, a mind slipping into confusion, Arsinoe began to fear for the future of her children. If he died, she would be vulnerable. Other claimants to the throne would circle like jackals. Indeed, the threat arrived faster than she expected. Lysimachus's own son, by another marriage, accused Arsinoe's children of plotting against their father. Whether this was true or not hardly mattered. The charge was pretext enough to poison the old king's mind. Court intrigue spiraled into paranoia, and in the chaos, Lysimachus finally died in battle against Seleucus, another of Alexander's generals. Arsinoe's position disintegrated overnight. She became a widow in a hostile land, surrounded by men who had no reason to protect her sons. Desperation drove her to a fateful decision. She offered herself in marriage to her half-brother, Ptolemy Keranos. Though he was ruthless and unpredictable, he was also one of the few men powerful enough to shield her children. But Keranos did not want merely an alliance. He wanted her submission, and perhaps, in his mind, her humiliation. Some chroniclers later whispered that even in this marriage, incestuous desire played its part. In truth, Keranos never respected Arsinoe as an equal. He treated her children as obstacles to his ambition. Soon enough, Arsinoe realized that she had walked into another trap. She began plotting her escape almost immediately. According to legend, she tried to have Keranos assassinated in his sleep. Whether she truly did or whether this was propaganda from her enemies is unknown. But what is certain is that the attempt failed, or never took place, and Keranos retaliated with a cruelty only a usurper can muster. He executed Arsinoe's two youngest sons in front of her, an act designed to break her spirit forever. Yet she did not break. In the dead of night, she fled with her surviving child, fleeing across the sea back to the only land where her family's name still carried the force of law and myth, Egypt. There, her younger brother, Ptolemy II and Philadelphus, sat on the throne their father had once claimed with sword and cunning. It is here, in this return to Egypt, that the tale darkens into something almost unthinkable. The surviving sources cannot agree whether Arsinoe's next marriage was born of love, desperation, or the inexorable logic of dynasty. But what they agree on is that she would soon be proclaimed not merely queen, but Philadelphus, the one who loves her brother. And in that single, cold title lay all the scandal and all the triumph of her life. The moment Arsinoe returned to Alexandria, she understood that survival would not come cheaply. She had lost nearly everything. Her first husband to war, her second to treachery, her sons to revenge. But she still possessed the one inheritance no rival could strip from her, the blood of Ptolemy, the divine founder. Her brother Ptolemy II had already begun to fashion himself into a living god. He had inherited not only Egypt's throne, but its centuries-old tradition of royal incest. For millennia, the pharaohs had married their sisters and daughters, declaring such unions sacred reflections of the gods, Isis and Osiris. What the Macedonian Greeks had once found shocking, they now adopted as the ultimate guarantee that their dynasty would remain untouchable. When Arsinoe stepped into his court, she carried with her both scandal and opportunity. Ptolemy II had recently divorced his first wife, Arsinoe, another woman who shared their father's blood. Officially, she was exiled for conspiracy, accused of plotting to overthrow him. Whether that accusation was true or simply convenient has never been proven. What mattered was that the throne beside Ptolemy was suddenly vacant. Arsinoe had seen enough courts to recognize her chance. Perhaps she told herself she was seizing control of her destiny. Perhaps she believed that if she was to be anyone's pawn, it might as well be her brother's. Or perhaps she had been raised for so long in a world where women were exchanged like treaties that she no longer distinguished between survival and surrender. Her marriage to Ptolemy II was declared not merely lawful, but divine. In a ritual designed to echo the myths of Egypt's most ancient gods, they were proclaimed Theoi Adelpho, the sibling gods. Priests in white linen sang hymns to their union, perfumed smoke curling around the painted columns of the great temple. Their portraits were carved into temple walls, their names joined on official decrees and silver coinage. To the common people, this spectacle was both astonishing and strangely familiar. The Greeks and Macedonians grumbled behind closed doors, whispering that the royal family had become no better than beasts. But among the native Egyptians, who revered the precedent of divine sibling marriage, The union strengthened the Ptolemies' claim to be not just conquerors, but rightful heirs of the pharaohs. In public, Arsinoe appeared serene, crowned and robed as the living consort of a god-king. But behind that composure lay the memories of every humiliation she had endured, the cold bed of Lysimachus, the murderous gaze of Keraunos, the blood of her sons staining her hands as she fled. She had been forced to watch her children die to preserve the ambitions of men who believed she was little more than an ornament. Yet here she stood, transformed from a fugitive into a queen whose power rivaled her brother's. Some historians have argued that it was Arsinoe's influence, more than Ptolemy's, that shaped Egypt's golden age in the decades that followed. She took a keen interest in the administration of the kingdom, the patronage of poets, and the construction of monuments that blended Greek sophistication with Egyptian awe. Arsinoe was not content to remain a passive figurehead. She insisted on appearing with Ptolemy in public ceremonies, an unprecedented assertion of her equality in rulership. The great procession of Dionysus, a spectacle of hundreds of gilded chariots and towering effigies, featured Arsinoe riding beside her brother in a golden chariot, hailed as a goddess incarnate. Even in death, she refused to be erased. She directed the construction of temples where she alone would be worshipped, her cult officially sanctioned by the state. In these shrines, priests tended her statues, offering daily libations and prayers. In effect, Arsinoe made herself immortal. Yet the marriage was never free of scandal. Greek poets outside Egypt wrote scurrilous verses mocking the brother-lover queen. In foreign courts, rivals used her incestuous union as proof that the Ptolemies had surrendered to depravity. But such condemnation mattered little as long as Egypt remained prosperous and unchallenged. It is tempting to look back on her life and see only the grotesque outlines of power gone mad. A woman who had been forced from marriage to marriage, from king to king, until finally she crowned herself queen beside her own brother. But to dismiss her as merely a victim or merely a schemer is to ignore the complexity that defined her. Arsinoe was both. She was the bruised survivor of unspeakable loss and the architect of a dynasty that would endure for centuries. She was a mother whose children had been butchered before her eyes, and a ruler who elevated herself to the status of a goddess. The last years of her life were spent consolidating this legacy. She sponsored expeditions to secure the Red Sea trade routes. She endowed libraries with thousands of new scrolls, determined that Alexandria should eclipse every Greek city as the cradle of learning. She funded sanctuaries to the gods, temples where her own likeness stood beside deities older than civilization itself. Perhaps most astonishing of all was how she turned the very scandal of her marriage into the cornerstone of her power. By embracing the mythic symbolism of sibling love, she made herself indispensable. To question her marriage was to question the divine legitimacy of the throne itself. And so, as the Nile rose and fell, as the tides of trade carried ships from Cyprus and Syria, Arsinoe's face looked out from countless coins, a reminder that the woman who had once fled in terror was now the mother of her people. But if she believed she had escaped her past, she was mistaken. The shadows of old betrayals never quite receded. In the final phase of her life, as her brother's health began to fail and her enemies regrouped, Arsinoe would discover that no queen, however deified, could ever be truly safe. In the hush of the palace corridors, where the scent of lotus oil mingled with the faint tang of ink in old papyrus, Arsinoe must have sensed that time was slipping through her fingers. She had built a fortress of ritual and spectacle, temples proclaiming her divinity, coins bearing her serene likeness. But the human heart is never fully insulated from memory. Every morning, she awoke beneath painted ceilings depicting the gods in eternal embrace. Every evening, she reclined in rooms where servants prostrated themselves as if in the presence of Isis reborn. But no gilded curtain could ever completely veil the faces of the sons she had lost, nor could the official decrees declaring her the sister wife of a god erase the knowledge that this last marriage had been the most unholy of them all. To the Ptolemaic court, however, these misgivings were irrelevant. What mattered was that the kingdom thrived under Arsinoe and Ptolemy's joint rule. Egypt's fields bloomed with record harvests, her granaries overflowing while famine ravaged lesser realms. Merchants from Rhodes, Phoenicia, and even distant Carthage lined Alexandria's harbors, bringing exotic goods that dazzled the local elite. Ivory from Nubia, incense from Arabia, glassware as fine as anything in Athens, all flowed through the warehouses controlled by Arsinoe's officials. She was no passive consort. She reviewed military musters, appointed high priests, and personally approved petitions brought before the royal council. In a world where women were expected to disappear behind lattice screens, Arsinoe insisted that her voice be heard, and obeyed. Yet, power of that magnitude always attracts resentment. To those who had never forgiven her for returning to Egypt in triumph, her prominence was proof of arrogance, even sacrilege. In private, some of Ptolemy's advisers whispered that Arsinoe was the true ruler, that her brother had become little more than a figurehead. Others claimed she was preparing to replace him entirely, to crown herself sole monarch in the ancient style of female pharaohs like Hatshepsut. No evidence survives that she ever planned such a coup, but the mere suspicion, repeated often enough, was corrosive. For every official who praised her wisdom, another seethed in silence, nursing old grudges. It is likely that Arsinoe knew this. She had lived too long in too many courts not to recognize the glint of knives behind polite smiles. And then came the rumors that Ptolemy's health was in decline. Some said he had developed a wasting disease, others that he suffered a stroke which left him weakened and prone to fits of melancholy. No chronicler records Arsinoe's thoughts as she watched her brother-husband fade. Did she feel sorrow? Relief? Fear? Perhaps all three, tangled in a knot no ritual could untie. She began to prepare for what must come after. She worked tirelessly to strengthen her cult, expanding the network of temples where she was worshipped as a living goddess. She arranged donations to the Alexandrian library and funded new endowments to scholars who would immortalize her reign in learned treatises. She secured pledges from key military commanders, ensuring that at least part of the army would remain loyal when Ptolemy was gone. But in those final months, Arsinoe also became more private. The royal processions grew less frequent. She appeared in public rarely, and when she did, onlookers claimed she seemed thinner, her face more lined. Some believed grief was consuming her. Others muttered that she had finally been cursed for her incestuous ambition. When Ptolemy II died sometime around 246 BCE, Arsinoe's enemies must have believed her power would vanish with him. In theory, the entire edifice of her influence rested on their joint claim to divine sibling rulership. Without the brother she had been compelled to marry, how could she remain more than a dowager queen? Yet Arsinoe had prepared too carefully, woven herself too skillfully into the machinery of state. Her cult did not merely survive, it flourished. Priests continued to chant her names at dawn and dusk. Offerings were made to her statues, as if she still reigned beside her brother. Her coins remained in circulation, each stamped with her crowned visage, and the title Philadelphus, the one who loves her brother. Even in death, she was determined not to fade. Her funeral was an unprecedented display of grandeur, a final assertion that the queen who had been forced from marriage to marriage would choose her own legacy. The embalmed body was carried through Alexandria on a litter draped in gold-threaded cloth. Processions of priests, soldiers, and poets followed, their chants echoing from the marble porticos. In the great temple precinct, the sarcophagus was lowered into a specially prepared tomb. There, her effigy was set up for eternal veneration, a serene, larger-than-life likeness gazing across the columns as if daring the centuries to forget her. And indeed, the centuries did not forget. Long after the dynasty she helped sustain had crumbled, after Cleopatra and Mark Antony had fallen before Rome's relentless legions, coins bearing Arsinoe's image were still buried in the Egyptian soil. When they resurfaced, clutched in a farmer's hand or gleaming in an archaeologist's trowel, the serene face on the silver disk seemed to whisper of a time when gods and mortals could be one. Perhaps that was Arsinoe's final triumph. To take every humiliation and betrayal, every whispered condemnation of incest and ambition, and transmute it into a myth that outlived all her rivals. In the official chronicles, she would be remembered as a divine queen, the sibling consort whose marriage sanctified her brother's rule. In private gossip, she remained the scandal of her age, the woman whose body had been the battleground for dynastic survival. And in truth, she was both. The little girl shipped off across the Aegean to marry an old general. The young mother who watched her children die for a crown she did not wear. The fugitive who fled back to Egypt with nothing but her name. The queen who turned incest into statecraft and survived to see herself deified. Today her story is still a warning and a fascination. A reminder that beneath every golden diadem lies the hunger that no dynasty can ever fully appease, and that sometimes in the palaces where history is written, love is not love at all, but simply the final mask worn by power. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.